unite and work together if we're all going to get through this.
Sounds like socialism to me.
The amount of people I see talking about socialism positively is actually staggering.
Do you think, do you really think that a proletarian revolution is just around the corner in America?
Grab your pitchforks and stab your mayor.
Your hero, Obama.
Hey, he's not my hero.
How heroic he comes
idiot. If Bernie Sanders were president, right, and he wanted to bring the same ideas as for socialism into this country, do you think that we would benefit?
Yeah.
But I just told you Venezuela's eating rats.
But I just want people to have health care. I don't want,
Same thing Hugo Chavez.
Oh my god. You people have, worms in your brain, honestly.
Welcome to episode 10 of the Sensible Socialist podcast. This week we're talking with Dr. Richard Wolff, who is named by New York Times Magazine as the world's foremost Marxist economist. Dr. Wolff was educated at some elite institutions around America and eventually started teaching economics at Yale University and eventually the City University of New York. He was briefly a mayoral candidate in New Haven in 1985, and after that he spent some time as a visiting professor of economics at the University of Paris. He's been a regular lecturer at the Brecht Forum in New York City, and at the same time Dr. Wolff was among the founders of the Association of Economic and Social Analysis and its quarterly journal Rethinking Marxism. He's currently a visiting professor in the graduate program in International Affairs at the New School University in New York City. The crisis of 2008 was a watershed moment for Dr. Wolff. The collapse of the sort of neoliberal stage of capitalist development brought out seemingly dormant trends in American political life, typified by the Occupy movement. Dr. Wolff spoke at the Occupy members gathered at Zuccotti Park. And since then, Dr. Wolff's public profile has really skyrocketed. He's been on Real Time with Bill Maher and a few short but oh-so-sweet appearances on Fox News. Dr. Wolff has moved out of the classroom and onto the streets and different meeting spaces around the country. He's given lectures on the problems with capitalism and the roots of the current crisis that we are, yes, still in. He's not just doom and gloom, though. He does have a prescriptive view and advocates for a new system. So in 2012, Dr. Wolff published Democracy at Work, A Cure for Capitalism, where he outlines and advocates for the creation and expansion of worker self-directed enterprises. That's a model of a worker-controlled economy, called, quote, required reading for anyone concerned about a fundamental transformation of the alien capitalist economy by none other than Cornel West. Dr. Wolff's book makes the case that state capitalism, what we might call Stalinism, or what in the 20th century they called communism, and neoliberal capitalism suffer from the same fundamental problem. Both systems lack democracy where it matters most. While both employed democratic processes in some form and in some part of the political landscape, in both Stalinist and capitalist arrangements, the workplace has always been devoid of democratic principles and norms. In brief, what Dr. Wolff argues is that we need democracy at work, where it's most needed and most missing. This idea, though, is still revolutionary, and it provides those of us seeking real and systemic changes now a platform to which to organize for a new economy. It provides a blueprint for a future socialist economy. The tangibility of the ideas Dr. Wolff espouses has launched a movement, Democracy at Work, and I'm a proud member of the DC action group Democracy at Work DC. You can check out our website, democracyatworkdc.com. While Dr. Wolff continues to spread the word and educate the larger public about worker self-directed enterprise through his radio show, Economic Update, it's syndicated all over the country, and he's got a monthly YouTube, Global Capitalism, videos that garner almost 100,000 views on YouTube each month. We, in DC, what we're trying to do is really organize Democracy at Work as a center for people to come and educate themselves about what worker co-ops could be. We are making a lot of connections with a lot of different organizations to really make worker cooperatives something that's going to be on the radar. We're happy to know that October in Washington, D.C., where I live, is Cooperative Month, and we're really working hard to establish worker self-directed enterprises and give incentives to make worker self-directed enterprises able to compete with capitalist enterprises who have gotten a lot of benefits and have had hundreds of years to be the ability to be successful. So what I think is important to understand about the idea of a worker self-directed enterprise is that the workers that work at a business own that business. They literally own it. They have shares in the business. So when the business does well, the workers do well. Now, you can still make arrangements that people get wages. You'd want to make sure that you do that so that everybody makes sure that no matter how the business is doing, they'll be able to have a sustainable and consistent paycheck. But the biggest problem with capitalism in the day-to-day is the fact that we go to work in dictatorships every day. We supposedly live in democracies, but we don't ever really participate in those democracies except for going to a voting booth every now and then. Even the place that we spend the most time, either our houses or our jobs, but definitely our jobs, are totally devoid of democracy. There are owners and managers who tell us what to do, and there's the rest of us who just do it. And so the idea of a worker self-directed enterprise is really going back to a basic idea. A cooperative. We all get together, we all participate in giving our labor, and we all get the benefits thereof. Worker self-directed enterprises are the key and are the example of a worker-directed economy. Co-ops are the way that we can realize and compete with the kind of organizations that we see around us, but that we also see crumbling. So in this week's episode, I talked to Dr. Wolff about co-ops, and we get a little introduction as to where they come from and what they're about. But also, I try to ask some questions about its relationship to socialism. And can worker self-directed enterprises really be the key to socialism? How do we understand them? And do workers in a self-directed enterprise exploit themselves? All right, let's take a listen to my talk with Dr. Richard Wolff, and let's see what he has to say. Professor Wolff, welcome to the Sensible Socialist podcast.
Thank you. I'm glad you're doing such a podcast, and I'm glad to be part of it.
Absolutely. So I want to kind of start by just laying a groundwork. So people are somewhat familiar with cooperatives. You know, I think a lot of people know of their local grocery cooperative or something like that. What differentiates a worker co-op as compared to some other kind of cooperatives, and what makes a sort of, you know, a worker co-op or a worker self-directed enterprise different and kind of special and worth focusing on as compared to, say, other kind of cooperatives?
Okay, good question, and let me try briefly to give you an answer. As with most interesting and important questions, one of the best ways to get into it is a little history. The notion of a cooperative, a cooperative way of doing business, that is producing goods and services in any community, doing that cooperatively is an idea that is thousands and thousands of years old. Mm-hmm. It's not new, it's not any of those things. It's been around for a long time because human beings in the beginning, as families, clans, tribes, and so on, tended to do things in cooperative manner. It seemed the natural thing. You can see it in animals as well, other animals. So it's an old idea of how to do things. And it was a way that human beings used to gather their food, to cook it, to clothe themselves, to provide shelter, and so forth. Over the years, the millennia, the centuries, other forms of organizing production happened. They evolved. Mm. And I'm going to give you just 3 examples because they're the important ones for today. The first one was a kind of slavery. In other words, you didn't cooperate in the sense of everybody carrying a reasonably fair share of the work. But instead, you divided the people involved in production into 2 opposing groups. The masters on the one hand and the slaves on the other. In general, the slaves did the bulk of the work. The masters, if they did anything, did what, let's be generous and call supervision, maybe some coordination. And And the masters made all the decisions. They decided what was going to be produced, what the technology would be, where the production would take place, and they got the fruit of the labor. Literally, everything the slaves produced belonged instantaneously to the master, and typically the master would return a portion of the product to the slaves in order that they be able to reproduce themselves so that they could come the next morning and do the whole thing again. The next one of those non-cooperative arrangements was feudalism. There again, they divided into two groups. In Europe, they were called lords on the one hand and serfs on the other. And to make the story brief, capitalism, which succeeded slavery and feudalism, was similar to them in also organizing the production system, the goods and services production, with a system divided between two groups, one of which is called an employer and the other one is called an employee. As with all these systems, the master, the lord, and the employer are relatively few in number, and the slave, the serf, and the employee are the vast majority. Likewise, in each of these systems, the few at the top, the masters, the lords, and the employers, have all the power. They again decide what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the net results.
Mm-hmm.
Now, those systems, because they are fundamentally unequal in the two roles assigned to people, they are fundamentally undemocratic in the sense that a few people make decisions that everybody has to live with, but the vast majority are excluded from participating in making those decisions. Given all of that, human beings have dreamt about, yearned for, believed in, hoped for, prayed for the alternative of a cooperative system. And throughout history, some people, for a whole host of reasons, were able to realize these dreams, these hopes. And they created cooperative enterprises of one kind or another.
Mm-hmm.
And so the word cooperate came to be a modern world. It simply means, literally, when people get together in non-antagonistic ways, pretty much dividing power, authority, products, and so forth, more or less equally, not literally rigidly, but more or less equally amongst themselves, as a community might, as the members of a family might, wouldn't necessarily, but might. And so, for example, some people decided that they wanted to cooperate by owning things collectively. So, for example, all through history and in the present as well, there are ownership cooperatives. So, for example, in a food co-op in some parts of the world, in some parts of the United States, in order for you to shop at the store, you have to become a part owner. And ownership is vested in the shoppers. They each maybe are asked to put in a few bucks to kind of buy a share of the enterprise. There's lots of ways of doing it. We have a whole movement in America called employee stock ownership plans, ESOPs. Those are arrangements in which the workers in an enterprise buy out the family or the shareholders who used to own it so that it becomes a cooperatively or collectively owned enterprise. Here's another example of cooperation. In the wine business, or among cocoa farmers in Ghana, what you have is individual farms, but they long ago learned that they could get a better price for the wine grapes or the cocoa beans if they cooperated in selling them. They all pooled their product and put them in a warehouse together, and then bargained with the wholesalers and the buyers to get the right price. And they could get a better price doing that cooperatively than if each individual farmer marketed his or her own product. So there you see cooperation when it comes time to selling. And that's different from the first example, which gives you the notion of cooperation in ownership. So there are other examples. And now to the point you wanted me to deal with. There's another way of cooperating, which is not about owning and not about selling, but about the actual work process itself. In other words, you don't, here's the key thing, you don't divide the people engaged in production into two antagonistic groups. No employer, employee. No master, no slave. No lord, no serf. Instead, you organize the production of the good or the service as a community of people, each of which has an equal voice, and all of them have this voice in deciding what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the products. Or if you're using a market system, what to do with the profits that all the workers there have helped to generate. We like to call this a worker self-directed enterprise because it puts the emphasis that we're talking about running or directing the enterprise day by day. And so it helps us focus people that that's the kind of cooperation we are interested in. Because for us, and that's why I did the history at the beginning, for us, this is a question of moving beyond those kinds of systems, which have been in the world now for a good, at least several thousand years, that took a turn we now wish to turn back from. They went away from the collective or cooperative system of production, which had existed for millennia, shifted to a what I would call a class divided or antagonistic system, slavery, feudalism, capitalism. And I think we're now at the end of that human experiment and are ready to go back and recreate a modern version of the collective, the community, the communal, or if you are not frightened by the word, the communist enterprise, because in fact, that's where the word was first applied. Communism, in the ideas of Karl Marx, for example, had absolutely nothing to do with the government. There was no notion that the government is one bit better able or appropriate to run an enterprise than a group of people who are not government officials, who do not work for the government, but function as a private association of individuals. So for us, we are much less interested in whether the private or the public, the state or the individual runs an enterprise. That's a big interest to people, but they're not us. For us, what matters is how the interactions among the people are organized, whether it's a public enterprise or a private enterprise. And to underscore that, again, the history helps. In slavery, we had public and private slavery. That is, private individuals could and did own slaves in most slave systems, but the state could also own slaves. And you had all different kinds of arrangements as to whether there was more private slavery or more state slavery. I think history has passed judgment that the interesting question about slavery as we look back is not whether it was more state or more private here or there. The question was slavery. And in the end, the slavery was abolished, and the people who did that didn't care whether it was public or private. They didn't want that relationship anymore. And likewise, the same with feudalism. You had private feudal manors run by lords, and you had public or state feudal manors run by the king or the state officials in the feudal history. And likewise, in capitalism, you can have a private capitalist system. That's when the enterprises are run by private individuals who have no position in the state. Or you could have the state do it, in which officials, people with a position within the state apparatus are the employers. They're the ones who go out and hire people and put them to work and tell them what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and they decide what to do with the profits. So yes, you can debate the pros and cons of private and state capitalism, like people debated the pros and cons of private and state feudalism or private and state slavery. But for us, the historical lesson is we want to deal with the organization of production. For us, capitalism's organization of employer versus employee is the central problem of our time, and the solution is a system change, changing the way the bulk of the goods and services are produced in our communities, in our societies, into a democratic, one person, one vote organization of enterprises. For us, that is a key solution to the systemic problems of capitalism, which we think are the issues of this period of historical experience.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely sort of right on the money, because especially when you think about Marx, the one thing that a lot of people will claim, especially about communist ideas or Marxist ideas, is the sort of utopian aspect of that. And of course, Marx and Engels really dealt with that. But one of the ways they say is, Marx talked about the end of history. And I think one way that is important to look at that is it's the end. It's not the end of history itself. I mean, time will still move forward, but it's the end of that history of human existence, the existence of class divisions and class dynamics that have found themselves produced in different forms. But like you said, we find ourselves at the point where we actually are able to take hold of all of the things that all of that development has produced, and be able to take hold of it and reacquaint ourselves with, dare I say, our human nature, or at least part of what may be our human nature, that we can actually sort of cooperate, and we actually achieve quite a bit of things when we cooperate. And I think it's I want to underscore what you said too, the idea that state ownership of anything means that you're talking about socialism or communism is a fundamental misunderstanding of what the words even mean, what they always have meant, and what they have meant sort of going back, forever. That the prevalence of that kind of argument, even especially as we see Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the Bernie Sanders and things like that, the constant bringing out of that trope is something that just belies the fact that people either genuinely don't know what they're talking about, or are using sort of straw men to tear down a point that we're sort of not making. But one thing that I wanted to kind of really get your perspective on, and this is something that I've heard in socialist circles and circles on the left, that is essentially, I think, the sort of most common kind of criticism. And there's a longer quote, I'm not sure I'll say the whole thing, from Rosa Luxemburg, who talking about cooperatives, and she says that they're a sort of hybrid form in the midst of capitalism, and they can be described as small units of like socialized production within a capitalist system of exchange. And in that capitalist economy, the capitalists still dominate production, and so the worker cooperatives have to compete with these more capitalist operated organizations and enterprises, which are based on just like pitiless exploitation. So because of this immense competition, the workers who are forming or operating in cooperatives in that same field of production are faced with like a contradictory necessity for governing themselves with what she calls utmost absolutism. And so they're obliged to take towards themselves the role of the capitalist entrepreneur. And so there's develops a contradiction. And I even saw a few people talking on like the communist Reddit and things like that about actually working in a cooperative where you talk about the sort of disillusion of the worker and owner dynamic. But when workers become owners, it doesn't always seem to dissolve that seemingly contradiction, especially when they're existing within a sort of capitalist form of production. And so is there a way, that's all is set up to ask, is there a way that we can take workers' sort of self-directed enterprises existing within capitalism and genuinely move them move that to be something like a worker self-directed economy. So where, we're not talking about having to compete with capitalist enterprises, and are worker self-directed enterprises able and capable of doing that sort of just by the fact that of their potential power, like we see in organizations like Mondragon, or are they within at least capitalist systems constantly going to be coming up against this kind of competition? So either they devolve into these capitalist enterprises, or they end up just sort of dissolving because they end up not being able to compete.
Good. It's a very important question, very valid. Let me try to answer it, but I'm going to do it again with some history, because I believe that will help people understand what the answer to your question is. And the history I'm going to explain is the transition, we call it, from feudalism to capitalism. This starts around the 16th, 17th century. Europe has been, in Europe I'm talking about, Europe has been a feudal society since the collapse of the Roman Empire, roughly 500 AD. So from 500 to 1500 or 1600, we're talking over 1,000 years of feudalism. Now, how did the transition from the feudal lord-serf system to the capitalist employer-employee system, how did it happen? Did it all of a sudden, sort of one day they changed over? No. Did it happen in 1 year when there was lots of revolutionary turmoil, say in 1789 in France? No. It in fact happened over hundreds of years. And it started when serfs, for a variety of reasons, ran away from the feudal farm where they were serfs, ran to the cities. I'm condensing the history here, because they could be free in the city. They were refugees from feudalism who gathered in the city, but very quickly understood that when they were a serf, they at least had enough access to land to grow the vegetables and raise the animals to survive. In the city, they couldn't do that. So they had to find another way to exist. And again, a long historical process, they began to enter into relationships with one another that were not slavery, that were not lord and serf, but they were what they eventually became, employer and employee. The early enterprises, therefore, that we're talking about, they didn't call themselves that, but we will in retrospect. They were early capitalist enterprises. And they had to compete in a feudal world. And in that process, they were all often dissolved. They were often defeated in those competitions. They were often crushed by angry lords that didn't want an alternative arrangement in some town near their feudal manors, etc. They had a very hard time. They had to find lots of difficult ways to exist. You had capitalist enterprises in cities that were eventually crushed by the feudal lords that lived in the countryside, so we never heard of them again. They were literally disappeared. The reason I stress this is that the basic answer to your question is worker co-ops are like those today, are like those capitalist enterprises were in the 15th and 16th century. They are the beginning. They are going to have to struggle to survive, to grow, and to meet and beat the competition and the oppression that a hostile capitalist system will sooner or later dump on them. Now let me be very concrete and specific. We have a capitalist system, say here in the United States, which has been in dominant position here for the entire history of our country. So roughly the end of the 18th century to the present, the 21st century. During that time, the institutions of our society, let's give you an example, the schools, they've adjusted. The schools have absorbed the capitalist system all around them. And so, for example, they teach people the importance of your individual effort. the importance of your individual success in competing against other individuals that want to get the prize in the school, the award, the promotion, the graduation honors, the appreciation of the teacher. Is there a detailed curriculum in how to work cooperatively? Almost never. Do we have courses in America's business schools? How to start a worker co-op? Almost never.
Right.
How to finance a worker co-op? Never. How to grow a worker co-op? Never. How to work on the interpersonal problems, the management problems in a co-op where everybody has an equal say, as opposed to the hierarchical structure of a typical capitalist enterprise. Well, one of the things worker co-ops will have to struggle with, and in fact they already do, is that for them to be served by the school system the way capitalism is already served by the school system, there's going to have to be, here we go now, changes in the curriculum. And I mean that from kindergarten right through the university. Capitalists are going to resist that, partly because they're not used to it, partly because it'll strike them as weird or strange or alien. But the co-ops are going to have to explain to them, you have a student body that's basically been trained to go to work in your institution, capitalism. All we're asking for is that young people also become exposed to, trained in, acculturated to an alternative. And those are going to be struggles. And in some communities, that the worker co-ops will win that struggle. In other communities, they won't. And then there's Let me give you another example. Banks are the institutions that gather our savings and then lend them to capitalist enterprises. When worker co-ops go to a bank, they say, we would like a loan, here's our business plan, et cetera, et cetera. But the bankers say, I can't give you a loan because you don't have a board of directors. I give loans to board of directors. You don't have that. No, we say, we are all on the board of directors because it's a co-op. Yeah, well, I'm not, I don't know who's responsible. End of conversation. You don't get the bank loan. Okay, that has to be changed in some way. That's going to be a struggle. In order to win that struggle, the worker co-ops are going to have to make a political intervention. They're either going to have to find allies, say Bernie Sanders people, that could be one, or they're going to have to create their own political party in order to contest in the larger society, simply to get for themselves and their industrial organization the kind of support from the government, from banks, from schools that capitalists take for granted. And that's going to be a political struggle. But that's exactly what the capitalist enterprises that emerged out of feudalism had to do. And that's what they did in town after town, in country after country. It wasn't all in a straight line. They would make some successes, then they would suffer some defeats. You know, you have to go through. That's the answer to your question. It's not, will the capitalist system make it hard for them? You bet your life it will.
Right.
Sometimes intentionally, other times just by being the dominant system, they make difficulties.
Right.
And that has to be struggled with. There's no magic to this. There's no guaranteed right or wrong strategy to follow. But to look at the situation and say, oh, gee, worker co-ops are isolated, instances in an otherwise capitalist environment, that's quite true. But basically, it's irrelevant. That's always the way change happens. It doesn't happen all at once. There isn't a nice, neat transition from one system to another. It's a long, difficult, and often bloody struggle. The American Revolution, the French Revolution, the English Revolution in the 17th century. These were ugly, experiences of warfare and suffering, and those are part of this kind of process. But it's never the grounds for saying it can't be done or
Shouldn't be done.
It's hard to imagine. I mean, let me give you another example, because you'll hear it if you haven't already. You'll hear it soon. Gee, people say, looking around at worker co-ops, they're kind of small. That is, it's 10 workers here, or maybe even 100 workers there, or maybe even 500 workers over there. But a modern capitalist mega corporation, we're talking tens of thousands of people. How in the world? And again, the history is the answer. Capitalism began when an employer and two people he met in town entered into the relationship we now call capitalism. Employer, employee. All the early capitalist enterprises were small. It took them a long time to become large. That was a transition they had to figure out how to achieve. Worker co-ops are exactly the same. But the news is good, because we already have examples of worker co-ops that started very small and have managed to solve the problem of becoming very large. You mentioned it, Mondragon. It starts in 1956 with a Catholic priest in Spain and 6, count them, 6 workers. Today, it's an enterprise with 100,000 workers. It has managed to become the 7th largest enterprise in all of Spain, while holding on to its worker co-op structure. So it turns out we already have the evidence that the transition from small to large is doable for worker co-ops, just as it was for capitalist enterprises, and before that, feudal enterprises, and before that, slave enterprises.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think if I could get still a little bit of time, ask you one more question that really touches on what you brought up, is that I think that this is a moment of where there are a lot of both worker self-directed enterprises and a number of different sort of I think left interests or radical groups are really looking for, I think, a political kind of outlet. And I'm wondering, it's a bit of a switching gears, and I know obviously your field of expertise is economics, but because you recognize obviously the importance of entry into politics and the political question that this really brings to bear, what do you think the prospects of doing that in the current paradigm with the Democratic Party? Bernie Sanders going into the Democratic Party, because I've in one of the episodes, and I've been curious about different people's perspective on the idea of trying to bring together a lot of the disparate socialist groups that have developed over the history of particularly American communism, and create some kind of united front organization like Syriza, a unity of the radical left in the United States. Do you think that's a plausible thing to do? Do you think we should? Is it possible to work within the Democratic Party? And you can be as brief or as long as you'd like on that answer.
I do absolutely think it's possible. I'll go further. I think that's what's on the agenda of the United States, and that's coming. And it's coming whether the left understands that and embraces it or not. And it's coming whether the right understands it, opposes it, or not. These things, when they happen, occur because of the structural, if you allow me, contradictions of a system that provoke people to ask questions they haven't asked before and to come up with answers that they haven't come up with before. So let me intervene politically by picking up exactly what we've been talking about. I think that what we need in America is a new political party that is unafraid of saying roughly the following. The Republican and Democratic parties are parties in their practice, but also in their ideology, that are 100% committed to capitalism. The Republicans want a kind of privatized capitalism with a minimum of government intervention, and they're willing to live with the inequality and all the rest that goes with it.
Mm-hmm.
The Democrats are fearful that if you let the system go that way, 60 or 70% of the people will be very poor and very angry and very bitter, and sooner or later they'll blow up the system because they won't tolerate it. And therefore it would be much wiser, and indeed makes for a better society, to take care of the bottom 50% or 60% or whatever it is,
Mm-hmm.
by a social welfare program, by a public school program, by a minimum wage, all of that,
Mm-hmm.
which the Democrats have traditionally endorsed and pushed. But their idea is to make a capitalism that works better, to redistribute some income and wealth from the super rich to the desperately poor, on the grounds that the wealthy will be safer in their wealth that way, and it's better to part with a little of what you have to hold on to the rest of it than to not do that and risk everything.
Mm.
So they've understood each other that way, and we have had a society in which they play musical chairs. We have a little bit of Republican government, then a little Democrat, then a little government, and the oscillation works real well, because when capitalism has a difficulty, which its unstable business cycles give it every few years, it can solve the problem by saying, oh, if you're not happy with the kind of capitalism we have, let's say the kind run by the Republicans, why don't you vote for the Democrats? Or if you don't like the way it's going under the Democrats, here's what you should do. You should vote for the Republicans. So when people got pissed off at Bush, they voted for Obama. When they got pissed off at Obama, they voted for Trump.
Mm-hmm.
And this is an old pattern. My response to that is, you're not going to solve the basic problems of American capitalism if your politics is confined to two political parties who are both champions of that system.
Mm-hmm.
That's just silly.
Right.
What you need, if you have a real politics, if you're serious about your politics, you should have a contest between one or more parties that think capitalism is great, like the Republicans and Democrats, and another political party, one or more, who say, no, we have an alternative economic system we think would work better for most Americans. And let the political struggle begin. Let these two sides make their claims, make their arguments, try to gather support in the ways that political parties do. But then you would at least have a politics that is dealing with the fundamental questions of our historical time, and giving people a genuine choice.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to stay with the capitalism that we have had throughout the history of our country, or do you think it is appropriate, necessary, for there to be some experiments with, some movement toward alternatives? And I think one of the first things that party would do, which, by the way, is why I'm confident it would be successful, is to say, look, the only way the American people can ever make an honest, democratic, informed choice as to how much capitalism they want, how much worker self-directed enterprise economic system they want,
Mm-hmm.
worker co-op, the only way that can happen is if you make a worker co-op sector, a significant sector of the American economy, that people will be able to think about working in, that people will be able to think about buying from, so that in every community, people can see and talk to their neighbors and friends and relatives about the two systems, since some of them will be in one of them and some of them will be in the other, and then having an idea of how they work and how people feel in them, then let's make the decision, what do people want? I'm perfectly happy to live with that decision, because I haven't the slightest doubt, none, that if you give the current generation of Americans a choice, would you rather work in a top-down hierarchical business where a tiny group of people at the top literally decide whether you have the job, keep the job, move up in the job, you don't move up in the job, close the factory, move the factory, take away your holidays or would you rather be in a democratic environment where everybody has one vote, all you and your fellow workers do, and you will collectively discuss and decide democratically what the pay scales will be, whether the jobs will move, what kind of pollution controls you will invest in, etc. I haven't the faintest doubt that a sizable and probably a surprisingly large part of the American people will vote for a significant sector like this because they want to experience it, they want to see it, they want to try it, and they sure as hell do not want to dismiss it without the opportunity to see how it works and so forth. The only reason in the end that this hasn't already been done in America, because let's remember, cooperative enterprises are as old as the United States. I sometimes have taken students to Pittsfield, Massachusetts, where there is something called the Shaker community, an old religious group from the very beginning of American society. They're called the Shakers. It's a Protestant denomination, if you like. It's a kind of Protestantism. They organized collective workplaces, worker co-ops, back in the the early days of American history when we were still a colony, and they're still around. But they can show you very clearly that this is a desirable way to work. They've survived centuries with that system, and they don't want to give it up because they like it. Just like if you go to Spain and talk to the workers at Mondragon, they'll tell you that they like it, which is the only reason that company has grown from 6 workers to 100,000 over the last half century, defeating, by the way, in competition, countless capitalist enterprises that competed with them and lost the competition. So I am very optimistic. I know that the reason we don't have those worker co-op communities in this country has been that the system doesn't want that. The system is afraid of that competition. The system does things legal and illegal to prevent it, and so on. Let me give you just one illustration so people don't have to fish around to get an idea of this.
Go ahead.
In the United States, because of the long history of American people feeling justifiably angry at private banks for ripping them off as depositors, as check holders, as borrowers, etc. A movement developed which the banks opposed to produce what we now call credit unions. These are arrangements, schools have them, colleges have them, workplaces have them. It's basically a collective, cooperative alternative to a bank. It's where all the people who say work in an enterprise put their money not in the local bank, but in the local credit union that is run by the workers and the employers together often. And as I say, it's a substitute for commercial and industrial banks. Their loan systems are much more generous. They're willing to work with people who have trouble paying back. They are a very important part of our credit system. They dispose of many tens of billions of dollars. This is not small potatoes, very big in America. But the banks hated it. The banks tried to stop it. And the banks were successful in making very strict limits on what kind of businesses credit unions could lend to. And here's a surprise. They can't lend above a small percentage of their deposits to any businesses, and they specifically can't lend it to worker co-ops. Now, come on. Now, the banks will honestly tell you they don't want competition. I mean, the honest ones will tell you, the dishonest ones won't. But the honest ones will tell you they don't want to have competition from the credit union. They're particularly sensitive about it now, since banks in this country have been found guilty of virtually every crime that a banker can perform over the last 6 years. Money laundering,
giving money to cartels,
manipulating the interest rates, manipulating the foreign exchange. I mean, You name it. What banks do, they do it illegally or unethically or both. So it's a time when everybody in America, virtually everybody, would feel better about putting his or her money into a credit union than into a bank.
Yeah.
The credit unions could become a collective, community-run banking system. And by the way, in Germany, the bulk of banking by individuals is done, you guessed it, in collective, cooperative, or public banks. So other countries haven't done what this country has. So I would say one of the first political struggles that worker co-ops would have is they would work closely with a political party that represented their goals to have the law changed so that credit unions can lend money to worker co-ops. Of course, they have to be prudent about that, not lend to a worker co-op that's in trouble or looks shady or anything like that. They have to show the same what's called fiduciary responsibility in their behavior that a regular commercial bank is supposed to follow. But the political party would be out there going to the public and saying pretty much what I'm saying, which is, why the hell should the credit unions that we put our money in be blocked from lending it to worker co-ops that we would like to see more of in our community, so we can buy from them and work in them and make an informed decision about what kind of structure of enterprise we want. I think a lot of Americans would be very responsive to that sort of appeal. And I think the Republicans and Democrats pushing against it in order to protect the profits of the big banks are in a much tougher position to support their approach than we would be. So I'm very happy to engage that struggle.
Yeah, so much for the free market, you know. Got to protect those banks in case, God forbid, they actually
By the way,
fund.
I'm glad you brought it up. I don't want to take too much of your time.
No, I have all the time in the world.
This free market stuff is also a hoot.
A joke,
That's the only way
yeah.
I can put it. On the 4th of July and on other festive occasions, businessmen and women get up in front of the Rotary Club or the Kiwanis Club or wherever they speak and give a little homily speech about the wonders of the free market. It's a little bit like when they go to church on Sunday and talk about loving their neighbors. We both know that when church is over and you go home and that annoying neighbor from next door is letting his dog do his business on your lawn, that the love your neighbor stuff wears out or wears off pretty quick.
Pretty quick.
And so it is with the free market. Because what most businesses do, and I have advised many businesses in my life, what most businesses do are constantly looking for a competitive edge. And if that means doing something against the free market, I've never met a businessman who will say, oh, or a businesswoman either, oh, I can't even think about that. I can't even discuss that because that violates my commitment to the free market. If you talk like that, your fellow businessmen and women would look at you as if you were a kook. In other words, yes, of course the big banks got together to pass a law that the credit companies can't. Of course the steel and aluminum companies in this country lobbied the Trump administration to enact tariffs to protect them against cheaper imported steel and imported aluminum. Yeah, you're not supposed to do that. Let me remind everybody, a tariff is a tax. The Republicans control the presidency and both houses of Congress. They have told us they are an anti-tax party. They've been telling that to us for the last half century. They are now busily imposing taxes, which have the name tariffs, in order to protect American enterprises that can't compete in the world the way they hoped they could, and are now getting government help in the form of taxes. So the next time you hear some Republican politician telling us about how they're the party against taxes, it's time to heave a spitball because you're being talked to as if you were 2 years old and didn't know what was going on.
Right, and you know the same kind of thing applies to to the Trump administration's basically easing the pain on on farmers, I guess would be the nice way of saying it. Again, to hell with what I guess. I mean, I don't know how you could call it free market when you're talking about tariffs and throwing money at people.
That, I can assure you that the idiocy of that particular act will be followed by the following: every group hurt by the policies of this government have now been given an instruction.
Mm-hmm.
When the tariffs hurt you, give you an example. All of the automobile companies, led by Ford and General Motors, have gone to Washington repeatedly over the last 6 months, threatening, begging, pleading for there not to be tariffs put on automobiles because it's going to hurt them.
Mm-hmm.
Now that they've seen that the farmers got $12 billion thrown at them for their pain, guess what they're going to ask for?
Go ahead.
They're going to ask Mr. Trump, hey, you gave them 12, we need 49. And then somebody else is going to say, I need 12 too. And what is he going to say? I give it to the farmers and not everybody else?
Mm-hmm.
There goes his reelection. He can't do that. So he has to give everybody. But he can't do that either because the money isn't there unless he taxes. Taxes who? Taxes the people he's promised he won't tax to. The man is walking himself into a dead end every which way he looks, which is why these actions are so desperate and unthought out.
Mm-hmm.
With the result that you can't do what you're promising, and that is a very dangerous thing for a politician to risk.
Mm-hmm. Especially when you are watching the rising tide of the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortezes and the Bernie Sanders and that whole, the talk of the blue wave is one thing, but there's a red tinge to that wave.
But there are people who love Mr. Trump.
Yeah.
Last December, he gave the business community in America an unheard of tax cut, turning over billions and billions of dollars that these companies had regularly had to pay in taxes. They don't have to pay. Mm-hmm. It was a gift that is extraordinary. And it came to the business community at the end of a 30-year period of record profits, of record stock market increase in value, at a time when the mass of people had not gotten an increase. He turned around and gave the overwhelming bulk of the tax cut to the part of the society that needs it least. He's got them in his pocket. He gave the military more than they asked for.
Yeah.
He's got them to support him. And then he has the 20 to 30% of American working people, mostly white, mostly older, who want America to be the way it was for them 30 years ago. And they want jobs, and they want their income more secure, and they want more income. He's promised them something. He hasn't delivered that yet. What he's delivered to them is theatrics.
Mm-hmm.
Nasty scapegoating of immigrants, big bloviating tweets, all of that. Yeah, but how long does the flim-flam man do the theater before people say, okay, thank you, that was very nice, we enjoyed it, but where is the payoff?
Right, and the swamp
I don't
isn't
see
drained.
where that's going to come.
Yeah.
The rest of the world, he may like prancing around that he's going to tell the Chinese what to do and the Europeans what to do, but just think logically. He's demanding that they knuckle under, that they change their laws to improve the wealth coming into the United States. These are countries that are less wealthy than the United States, being asked to limit their wealth accumulation to make life easier for the selling and buying for America. They're supposed to give up their well-being in order to help Mr. Trump deliver on his political promises. If they knuckle under and do that, Mrs. Merkel in Germany, Mr. Macron in France, Theresa May in England, or anybody else, their own people will kick them out. Their own people will say, are you crazy? You're making our lives more difficult to help Donald Trump out of his political jam? We don't want you as a leader. Their political enemies will make hamburger out of them, and it'll take all of 3 weeks. So they can't do it. So Mr. Trump is presenting them with an impossible game. So this can't go on. So what they're going to try to do, you'll watch it now. They will try to develop a smokescreen theater in which each of them says all kinds of things for their domestic political survival, and nothing changes.
I mean, I did hear...
But the problem with that is it isn't going to change the lives of those 20 to 30% that are his political base, Mr. Trump's base. He's not going to be able to give them the job they want. He's not going to be able to give them the income they want. He's not going to be able to give them the security in that job and that income that they want, which means it's going to be all blah, blah, and no real results. And if I were Mr. Trump, I would be as nervous as I think he is about where this situation looks to be headed.
Yeah, the funny thing that when I hear you say that too, I mean, I understand what you're saying. The thing that it's very different than what you're going to hear on anywhere from NPR to MSNBC or CNN or anything. Like what you hear on all of those is right. Like unless Trump is impeached, he's got another 4 years. And so as a parting question, because I know you got to go, but like as a sort of parting question, what do you think accounts for the difference between the analysis that you gave, which is based on a certain kind of view, and the view that we do get from something like what would be called the mainstream media? Why such a different sort of hypothesis?
Of a different perspective. My perspective is that the problems we have are symptoms of a basic issue, and that's the economic system of capitalism. The people in the mainstream media have never been exposed to that argument. They weren't exposed to it in elementary school, in high school, in college. They don't read it in their newspapers. They don't hear it from their professors. They don't hear it from other journalists. Politicians don't talk about it. You remember that moment, I think it was a year or two ago, when Nancy Pelosi, the head of the Democratic Party, was giving a speech somewhere, and a young male student stood up and asked her a question about socialism. And she looked at him, because you could see it. There was a video, it went viral.
Yeah.
You could see her confusion was written all over her face, and she turned to the man and she said, "But," I quote you, "but we're all capitalists." She couldn't answer his question. She had no idea what he's talking about.
What I've seen on NYU's campus and what I've seen in polls all over, in CNN even, a Harvard University poll last May showed that people between the ages of 18 and 29, not just Democrats, not just leftists, 51% of people between 18 and 29 no longer support the system of capitalism. And that's not me asking you to make a radical statement about capitalism, but I'm just telling you that my experience is that the younger generation is moving left on economic issues. And I've been so excited to see how Democrats have moved left on social issues. As a gay man, I've been very proud to see you fighting for our rights, and for many Democratic leaders fighting for our rights. But I wonder if there's anywhere you feel that the Democrats could move farther left to a more populist message, the way the alt-right has sort of captured this populist strain on the right wing, if you think we could make a more stark contrast to right-wing economics.
Well, I thank you for your question, but I have to say we're capitalist, and that's just the way it is. However, we do think that capitalism is not necessarily meeting the needs with the income inequality that we have in our country. And let me just tell you this. I don't know how much time we have. About 40 years ago, a little bit more now, no less a person in terms of capitalism than the chairman of the Standard Oil of New Jersey said. He talked about stakeholder capitalism. Capitalism that said when we make decisions as managements and CEOs of the country, we take into consideration our shareholders, our management, our workers, our customers, and the community at large. At that time, the disparity between the CEO and the worker was about 40 times more for the CEO than the worker. As productivity rose, the pay of the worker rose, and the pay of the CEO rose. Everything rose together. Around 20 years ago, it started to turn into, maybe 15, 20 years ago, it started to turn into shareholder capitalism, where we're strictly talking about the quarterly report. So a CEO would make much more money by keeping pay low, even though productivity is rising, the worker's not getting any more pay, and the CEO's getting a big pay because he's kept costs low by depriving workers of their share of the productivity that they created. And as I call it, a right angle going in the wrong direction. The disparity between the CEO and the worker under the shareholder capitalism is more like 350 to 400 to 1. From 40 to 1 to 350 to 400 to 1.
Yeah.
So for me, I look at this and I say, is capitalism, the system, in trouble? Does capitalism have these problems? And if so, does it have a solution? I see the problems, I see that they're systematic, and I don't see a solution. And I'm looking for one because I know that systems can find solutions to their problems and continue for another while. This one may be able to do that too. I'm not at all sure that Mr. Trump will not get reelected. Listen, he has the money, he has the publicity, he has the American educational system basically on his side. If he plays it right, if he buys the right advisors and the right PR and advertising, he may persuade people that his theatrics are actually doing something, or that his opponent will do something awful. American politics is decided in ways that have very little to do with the system, because the two parties don't disagree about the system. They simply disagree on how best to protect it. So for me, I'm coming at it in a completely different way. And so, of course, my analysis is different because I see the problems in a different perspective. Now, if you're saying, and if you're not, I would urge you to, that this country would be better off if it had a much wider range of perspectives presented to it every day, every week, so it could look at this from different perspectives, then the answer is, of course it would be. But we don't have a free market of ideas. Ideas that are critical of capitalism find obstacles to being heard at every turn, whereas ideas that take capitalism for granted as the best thing since sliced bread are heard on every street corner, on every radio and television station in the country innumerable times every day. So we don't allow a free market of ideas for the same reason that we don't allow a free market in imports, because we're protecting certain interests that don't want that. They'll give a speech about the free market's wonders, but they don't want it. They'll give a speech about the marketplace of ideas, but they don't want that either. So that's the reality we have to live with. We still have enough freedoms in the United States to make the kind of argument I'm making with you now, and to enable you to share it with other people. And I do have a weekly radio and television program where I can develop these ideas. And I'm grateful for that freedom. Other countries don't have that. That's a plus for the United States.
Yeah.
But it is our obligation to open that space much wider than it is now having been allowed to be. And if that's happening, it's not happening because we're good at it. It's happening because capitalism's problems are very deep and they're not being solved. That's why people turned against the political establishment, both the Republican and the Democrat. The people who voted for Trump voted for something different. They were disgusted with the old establishment. You could see it in the Republican primaries at first, and then you saw it again with the defeat of Clinton. I don't think you're not going to turn this back. And if Mr. Trump goes away, let me give you something to think about. The next version of what he represents will make Mr. Trump look good. Because these are problems that are deep, that are not being faced by this society. If he fails to give the 20 to 30% of older, established white workers some kind of solution, they're not going to stop being angry. They're not going to stop being bitter. What they'll look for is somebody else who might give them a better shot. And maybe they'll find that in Bernie Sanders. But they also may find it in David Duke
Right.
or someone like that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's, I think obviously if you're looking back, going back to history, the times that, after economic struggles, especially that aren't, some kind of depression or panic or something like that, where there's nothing that really happens and the situation just sort of maintains itself, the results tend to not be, it's you get results where you get a New Deal in the United States and you get fascism in Italy and Germany. And so the
People
situation...
should remember that when capitalism broke down in 1929 and deteriorated at an incredible rate from 1929 to 1933, you had people in extremis, and they made extreme decisions. And you're quite right. In the United States, luckily, that extreme went to the socialist side, the left-wing side, and gave support to a progressive Democrat. It's the most you want to say about Mr. Roosevelt. But the same collapse of 29, the same deterioration in Germany, a very progressive country at that time, produced Adolf Hitler and all that he represents. So there you have, this is a capitalism that is now going through the second worst collapse in its history, and it is producing what should have been understood to be predictable political consequences. And we are just in the middle of that, and it's not at all clear how that's going to play out.
Absolutely. Well, one of the things that when you were talking about it too, the idea of free speech and not there being obstacles to socialist voices and stuff like that. It's part of the reason I wanted to start this whole thing anyway. It might get another way to do it, and let's try to.
You to be really, Kevin. I mean, there's not as a personal flattery. This is important things that you're doing. This is a courageous thing, and this is a real contribution. People hearing this kind of a conversation don't have that opportunity very often, and this will be stimulating. It's not that they have to agree with everything, of course not, but to listen and to think and to let yourself become a real player in the world, because you're beginning to understand what's going on. It's a much healthier feeling than being always on the edge and tuning out the news because you don't understand what it means.
Or it's just so upsetting all the time because it's only showing you things that are
Lord
terrible.
Knows it is.
Yeah, Facebook can be
Anyway,
poison.
if you want to do this again sometime, let me know.
Yeah, absolutely. I really, really appreciate it. And the idea, I'd really love to hear your ideas on the UBI and like the relationship with automation. I think that would like really be fascinating.
Let's do that. Let's do that next time.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely.
Yes, please send us some form of link or copy because we can also post and promote them.
Absolutely, yeah. I will. I'll spread it as far as I possibly can, and people listening to this episode will already have gotten an introduction to Democracy at Work. But definitely, obviously, check out democracyatwork.info. And Professor Wolff has obviously the Economic Update, the radio show. And how many stations are you on now?
Well, we're on about 95 radio stations, and through Comcast and the Free Speech TV network, we go into over 50 million homes. I mean, they don't all watch the program, but they could. They have it available. If I might add, you can see the weekly program on YouTube. You just go to the Economic Update YouTube channel, or the way to support us, if you're interested, is with Patreon. Just go to the website, patreon.com. That's Patreon. Patreon.com/economic update, and not only the radio programs, but other interviews, a little bit like this one, are also available there.
Awesome. Yeah. So if you're interested, there's plenty to find out, plenty of places to look. Check out Professor Wolff's books. There are many, and they are all fantastic. And let's do it again, and we'll talk about some other issues. But I really appreciate it.
To Liz, I know you're in touch with her.
Absolutely, will do. And I really appreciate your time. And thanks a lot. Let's do it again.
Take care.
All right. Bye. All right. So that was my talk with Professor Wolff. We originally had it sort of scheduled just for a half hour, but as these conversations go, it ran a little long, and I think that's all right. I think this episode was a good introduction to not only worker self-directed enterprises, but also some of the issues that come up a lot of times in leftist circles, but also just talking to people generally about the possibility of a worker self-directed enterprise and a potentially worker self-directed economy. That's what I would call socialism, or that's what I would call communism, and socialism would be the way that we engage in the political struggle that Dr. Wolff was talking about. So hopefully we'll do another episode with Dr. Wolff. I appreciate you guys checking out the podcast, and check out democracyatwork.info and Economic Update. All right, see you next time.
But I don't want to catalyze synthesize the second final solution. Don't want to be the Steve Smith of the revolution. See the analogy when the Oilers, the World Bank, the Flames. 2 minutes remain in the 7th game of the best of 7 series. Yeah, Jesus saves, Gretzky scores. The rich get more. One wrong move, we risk the cup. Play the man, not the puck. Don't we plant a mechanic virus and erase the memory of machines that maintain this capitalist dynasty? And yes, I recognize the irony. The system I oppose affords me the luxury of biting the hand that feeds. That's exactly why privileged fucks like me should feel obliged to whine and kick and scream. Yeah, till everyone has